So that's it, the WWDC keynote is over for another year. But where was the new MacBook Pro? Hello and welcome back to macOS Reviews. Thank you as always for subscribing if you have, and if you haven't, the button is just down there. Yesterday was Apple's WWDC keynote. There were loads of memojis, tons of the usual dad jokes from Craig Federighi, but there wasn't a single piece of hardware. Now I know if you are a developer, you'll be watching this thinking, what are you talking about, Mark? WWDC is for development, it's for software, it has nothing to do with hardware. You should never expect hardware at WWDC. However, the rumours leading up to this event about new MacBooks, potential new Mac Minis, even some kind of refresh to the MacBook Air were huge. As it turns out, they announced zero hardware. This is a big lesson for people like me and for some of the leakers out there. We don't know what Apple are going to do. It does mean if you were holding off getting a MacBook, then go ahead, go for whatever you were going to go for, because I don't think now we'll see anything remotely Mac related until later this year. But I thought today I'd quickly jump on the camera and just give you my first initial impressions of the WWDC keynote. There was so much stuff in there, so I'm going to miss things out in this video. So if I miss things that you think I should have talked about, don't worry, I will cover them in future videos. But here's what I thought were the most important and the most exciting announcements from yesterday's WWDC keynote. If there's one criticism I have about the keynote this year, it's the continual references to living in this new world where we will have reduced contact, interacting with people digitally. Now that is, I suppose, a reflection of the way that we live these days anyway. It has obviously been accelerated somewhat by recent events, but it just bothered me a little bit that Apple's development roadmap seems to be driven quite a bit by this new normal that we're now living in. I think iOS 15 is quite a good example of where this manifests itself. It was all about staying connected remotely, reliving past photo memories, completely removing the need for a traditional wallet. Pretty much any card, if you live in the States mainly, but pretty much any card that you have now is going to be soon available in the Apple Wallet app. And then things like helping you stay focused at home with some pretty cool looking focus features for iOS. But they placed a massive amount of emphasis on FaceTime. And again, this comes back to the whole working remotely, communicating with your friends and family via video calls. And they have put quite a significant amount of effort into improving FaceTime and making it spookily like Zoom. So for instance, there's a mode now which blurs the background of your image while you're talking. There's a grid view when you've got more than 2 or 3 people on the call. There's also voice isolation where it blocks out noisy backgrounds so you can talk without the other person being distracted by all the people in the background talking and stuff going on behind you. But there's one feature with the new FaceTime update which blew me out of the water. And it seems quite innocuous at first. And it's basically the ability to share a link to your FaceTime call to pretty much anyone. So you basically get a link, you send it off via email or message or whatever you like. That person receives that link and they can join via pretty much any device. And that includes, apart from obviously Apple stuff, it includes Android devices and web browsers. And that means you can join a FaceTime call if you've got an Android phone or a Windows PC. Now that isn't going to completely wipe the floor with services like Zoom and Teams and Skype and that kind of stuff, because there'll always be a place for other non-Apple services, particularly when it comes to video calling. The only difference now is that because it's so easy to just turn to FaceTime if you're a Mac or an iPad or an iPhone user, you're more likely to do so than to fire up Teams or Zoom. The other big thing they've added to FaceTime is something called SharePlay. And this is essentially where you can watch videos or listen to music together in perfect sync with the people that are on the call. Now this comes into play with other Apple products a bit further down the line, which we'll get to in a bit. But again, it's something you can't really do with a service like Zoom. They're also introducing spatial audio for FaceTime. We're going to see lots of spatial audio, I think, this year and beyond from Apple. And it's pretty smart. The way they've done this with FaceTime is to basically use spatial audio to virtually place the people that are on the screen in your stereo field. So if someone is on the left-hand side of the screen, your AirPods, it will only be compatible with AirPods, will basically make it sound like they are there. Really cool. It works very well for movies and TV shows at the moment. Again, I've not heard this, but in theory, it sounds like a pretty cool feature. And the rest of the updates to iOS, they're fairly light, really. I mean, they've improved the notification screen. That looks quite nice. You can have group notifications and you have more control over how and when they appear. And they have something called Focus, which enables you to customize what the phone does depending on what you're doing. So you can set up specific focuses for activities like working, studying, chilling out with your mates, whatever. And the focus mode will change what the phone displays on the screen and what it does and the things it notifies you about, depending on what you are doing at the time. So a few updates, nothing major apart from FaceTime, which I didn't see that coming really, but it's one of those things that you suddenly realise is absolutely obvious given A, the world we live in, and B, the fact that Zoom has completely taken over the world in terms of video calling, and Apple obviously wants a much bigger part of that pie. iPadOS was the big one. Owners of iPads, particularly owners of iPad Pros and the M1 version, I've made my feelings on that very clear. I'll link to a video above where I talk about why I think it's Apple's most boring release of recent memory, but we were all pinning our hopes on a big iPadOS update. We're not really getting that. Instead, we're getting widgets. And if you've used widgets on the iPhone, widgets on iPadOS 15 are exactly the same. It's an obvious update. It's needed. I mean, the kind of the semi-widgets that you have on iPadOS at the moment aren't really widgets, whereas in iPadOS 15, there'll be proper widgets, and yeah, great. They also made some changes to multitasking, which looks genuinely better than it is now. That's not difficult. I think multitasking on the iPad has always been a little bit ham-fisted. Whereas in iPadOS 15, they've introduced new ways of arranging your apps on the screen. There's a nice little picker that comes down from the top where you can say, put that app on the left-hand side, the right-hand side, whatever. There's also something they've introduced called the shelf, which is where you can basically minimize elements of an app into its own little dock, if you like. Again, pretty cool. Not that exciting. There's quick notes. I use the Notes app now in iPadOS and iOS far more than I used to. I might do a video on that at some stage. Let me know if you want me to in the comments. So it was nice to see that, again, they're actually doing quite a bit with notes in iPadOS, and that includes the ability to draw up a quick note wherever you are in the operating system. But you can also tag notes now. You can invite people to work on the notes with you by mentioning their name. Again, nice updates, the sort of stuff you expect from an iterative update to an operating system and its apps, but not exciting. And certainly nothing like some of the things we were hoping for that would make more use of that M1 chip in the iPad Pro. We'll come back to the iPad a bit later because there is something very exciting they've done with macOS that relates to iPadOS. But again, it doesn't relate to the M1 iPad. It just felt like a light sprinkling of new features and tweaked existing features. It just wasn't the big iPadOS update we were hoping for. Now, WWDC is all about software, as I mentioned at the start of this video, and I'm a massive fan of indie developers. I always use indie apps as much as I can. One of my favorite developers is a company called MacPaw, who are very kindly sponsoring this video. And today I want to very quickly mention their fantastic platform, which is called Setapp. Now, Setapp is one of those things where you just can't quite get your head around how much value you're getting out of it. Basically, for $9.99 a month, you get access to over 200 brilliant apps. That's it, that's all you pay. You don't pay per app, you don't pay anything more if you download a certain number of apps. You get access to all of them and you can install as many of them as you want at any time. And it includes the brilliant Clean My Mac X, which I'm a big fan of, Ulysses, iStat Menus, Bartender, AdGuard, ClearVPN, Mars Edit. The list goes on and on and on. And as I said before, there's no limit to the number of apps you can install. There's no ads. All of the apps are completely unlocked. So for example, if you use Ulysses, it's the full version of Ulysses. Now, Setapp has saved me quite a bit of money actually in terms of only paying that fixed monthly fee of $9.99 versus buying all the individual apps individually. It could probably do the same for you. It's definitely worth checking out. You can look at their website and see which apps they have. There's some really cool little apps in there that have their own little features that could be very useful for you during your day. It's just unbelievably good value, really. So I really recommend checking it out. To do that, have a look at the link in my description and yeah, see what you think to Setapp. So on to macOS, and this version is called Monterey. Now, Monterey? I've probably got that horribly wrong. I'm terribly British with this. Every time a new macOS version comes out, I normally have no idea where the place is that they're referring to in California, so that's me perhaps not being well travelled enough, I don't know. But it's the new version of macOS, it's coming later this year, and it's getting all of these kind of removed from personal contact, remote living, remote working, focused work type updates that we saw on iOS and iPadOS. Fine, no problem at all. That means we get the same FaceTime updates, which are pretty cool. It's getting spatial audio as well. It's also getting this shared with you thing, which I didn't talk about earlier, but very quickly, it's basically a way of the operating system picking up on anything that people have shared with you on iMessage. So whether that be links to websites, photos, etc., music, playlists, and that kind of thing. And it groups all that stuff together in one place so you can see exactly what's been shared with you on messages from your friends and family. There's also some really cool changes to Safari. I'm a big Safari user. I use Chrome occasionally when I have to, but I use Safari 98% of the time. And the biggest change really, apart from all the speed updates and the kind of security features, is a new tab management system. I'm a big tab user. I'm not the sort of person that leaves thousands of tabs open all the time, but I'm not that good in terms of tab management. So to see them offer this really cool way of viewing tabs rather than having these little kind of tabbed windows everywhere was great. They've also introduced tab groups, so you can basically have a bunch of categorized tabs. That would be quite handy from my perspective. I can imagine having different tab groups for work-related stuff, home-related stuff, things related to this channel. It just looked really cool, and obviously it syncs between your devices as well. It's also getting the notes updates that I mentioned earlier for iPadOS 15, but there were two things which really caught my eye. The first one was shortcuts. Now, I'm not a big shortcuts user. It's something which exists on iPadOS and iOS at the moment, and I'm always being told on my Discord server, link in the description by the way if you want to join, it's completely free. But I'm always being told by some much smarter members in there than me that I'm missing out big time on shortcuts. And I've dabbled with them. And if you don't know what shortcuts are, they're basically ways of building these little macros which can perform tasks or perform multiple tasks in one go with one press of a button. They can open different apps, they can send things into apps. It's just a great way of customizing your device almost entirely based on the way that you want to use it. I do love the idea, for some reason, of it coming to the Mac, because I'm on my Mac all day. It's the thing that I do all my work on, and the idea of being able to customize it with some automations. I know you can do this with Automator. That is the kind of old version of shortcuts, which I think is being deprecated with shortcuts. I know you can use it for that, but I've never have done. I've just never had the time to invest in it. I'm quite excited about putting that to use on the Mac, so that is coming as well. Very excited about that, but I'm far more excited about the changes they've made to continuity. Now, continuity is a thing where at the moment you can, for example, copy some text on your iPhone and paste it onto your Mac without doing anything apart from hitting copy and hitting paste. It just does it magically. In the next version of macOS, they're introducing something called universal control. And this basically means you can share your trackpad, your mouse, your keyboard between multiple Apple devices. So if you're working on your MacBook and you have your iPad by the side of it, you can move your mouse cursor across to the iPad and it will appear on the iPad. Now, at the moment you can do that with something called Sidecar, but that is like an extended display. You have to turn it on and it doesn't always work actually. I've had a lot of problems with Sidecar, but this isn't. Universal control is something completely different. It's entirely seamless. So you literally don't have to do anything. You just have your iPad next to your Mac and you can control either of those devices with the exact same keyboard and mouse. And it even works between more than two devices. So during the demonstration, Craig Federighi showed us moving some content from an iPad, which was over here, through a MacBook, and then eventually onto an iMac, which was running Final Cut Pro, and placed the footage or the image or whatever it was onto the timeline. Crazy and genuinely useful. So this ability to share the input device and share content between devices like that and so easily without having to switch anything on will be game changing for a lot of users. And this got me thinking, well, maybe this is the M1 iPad's party trick. Perhaps you need an M1 iPad to make that possible. But when you dig further and you look into the compatibility list for universal control, it's not the case at all. You can actually run this on, for example, Macs that go right back to 2015, but you can also run it on much earlier versions of the iPad Pro. So you don't need the M1 iPad Pro for this. So again, if we go right back to the iPadOS 15 part of the WWDC keynote, I still can't work out what they're doing with that M1 chip in the iPad Pro. I'm not going to make this video about that device again. I have linked earlier to my thoughts about it, but I was expecting more. Universal control is brilliant. It's the one thing with the next macOS release which I genuinely cannot wait for, but it still isn't making use of that M1 iPad Pro. If there's one operating system that didn't get a huge amount of attention at this year's WWDC, it was the Watch and watchOS. And it was interesting that they gave us some insight into the kind of things they keep an eye on. So we learned, for example, that the Photos watch face is the most popular and that the Breathe app was used most regularly last year, which is no surprise. So it's just interesting to see that I'm sure it's all anonymous, but they obviously keep tabs on what people are using most often, and they've been focusing their development efforts for watchOS on those items. So the first one with the Photos watch face, they're going to introduce the ability to add portrait photos to your watch and use all of that data that separates your head and face from the background to do some really cool things with the display. So for example, it will place the time behind your head, just slightly behind your head and the background, just to give the whole thing some depth, and you can kind of zoom in and zoom out of your face and all that sort of stuff. They look like beautiful watch faces, so I love that idea. And they've done a lot with the Breathe app, so they're introducing lots more mindfulness features for it. I don't use it. I tried it when it first released in whichever watchOS version it was. I'm not the sort of person that invests much time in mindfulness, but I know it's become a very important thing for a lot of people. The changes they're making to watchOS, although they're fairly light on the surface of it, they did some stuff with fitness as well, there's new workouts and things. Although it's fairly light on the surface, they have focused and honed in on the things that clearly mean the most to people who own these devices. Just a very quick note on tvOS. I very recently finally bought the Apple TV 4K, which is up there. I'll leave a link to my recent review. And as mentioned in that review, I completely apologise for my previous dismissal of the Apple TV. It's a fantastic device. But tvOS didn't get a huge amount of love really in WWDC this year. Most of what they're doing is linked to this whole remote sharing of content. So you can basically have that same ability on your Apple TV to watch TV shows with people remotely and listen to music and that kind of stuff. And it looks quite good. I think if you've got a lot of people who've got Apple TVs in your family and you are communicating remotely with them, it does look quite enjoyable. So if you've recently bought an Apple TV, or perhaps you've had one for a little while, if you were expecting a bit more from tvOS this year, you might have felt a little bit shortchanged. One last thing to mention is the fairly significant portion of the event they devoted to privacy. They're outspoken when it comes to their stance on data privacy. It's very admirable. They're doing lots to combat that. So the stuff they're doing includes privacy protection in mail, which means goodbye to tracking pixels pretty much in emails. Also the ability to have your IP address completely hidden from public view while using Safari. That's pretty useful. There's also an app privacy report. And they're also changing Siri so that you can do quite a lot, an impressive amount actually, of voice commands even if you don't have an internet connection. So at the moment, Siri relies on an internet connection to do pretty much anything, whereas later this year, after the updates come on board, you'll be able to ask it to do all sorts of things, even if it's in airplane mode, so you don't have any internet connection whatsoever. All the voice processing happens directly on the phone, but also the data, so your voice data, never leaves the phone, it never goes anywhere. So that's great stuff, I love that. But the big thing was iCloud Plus. Again, I had no idea this was coming. This is one of those things that was never rumoured. And if you've got an iCloud subscription at the moment, you'll get iCloud Plus for free. There's no additional charge whatsoever. Again, it's focused pretty much entirely on privacy. So it gives you a recovery contacts option for your Apple ID, so you can give basically the ability for people within your family or your friends to help you retrieve your Apple ID information. They never get access to it, but they can give you a code to get you back into your account. You can also create a whole bunch of random email addresses which are linked to your own, so you never expose your own email address, but you do receive email that comes to those randomly generated email addresses. But the big thing was their take on a VPN connection. And this will basically mean that you can use iCloud to connect to the internet without sharing any of your location data, your IP address or anything. It's completely private browsing. And if you use a VPN for work, for example, or if you use a VPN when you're working in a coffee shop or out and about somewhere where you don't want to have your traffic potentially on display to horrible people, iCloud Plus will have that built in. And just like those spookily Zoom-like additions they're adding to FaceTime, this addition to iCloud makes for a compelling reason not to have a third-party piece of VPN software. Now, for indie developers who create that software, I genuinely feel sorry for them, because they'll have watched that event yesterday thinking, what do we do now? Again, I've not used this yet, remains to be seen what it's like, but knowing Apple, they don't mess about when it comes to privacy, and they do things very well when it comes to integrating services seamlessly and abstracting away all the techie stuff. So lots of positive privacy updates and iCloud Plus, which I didn't see coming and I'm quite excited about. Now, as mentioned at the start of this video, I'm fully aware that I've skimmed over some of the stuff that was announced yesterday. It was just a jam-packed event. Apple are absolutely cramming stuff into these events these days, which I love. It makes my job a little bit harder, but I hope I've kind of focused on the things that for me are the most impressive, the most interesting, the most thought-provoking. If you think I've missed something glaringly obvious today, it's quite possible. Please get involved in the comments, and also just let me know what you think about WWDC this year. What are you excited about? What disappointed you? What is exciting about what's coming later this year? Get involved in the comments. But if you are thirsty for Mac hardware, because we didn't get any this week, and I think, like I said before, we're probably not going to see anything now until later this year in the autumn/fall. So if you're thirsty for Mac related stuff, keep watching for a link to my recent 24-inch M1 iMac review. But in the meantime, thank you as always for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.